Same with, for example, we talked about the Jack 5 diamonds. It's very infrequent, but it raises a very small percentage of the time. Or like a hand like Jack 4, for example. This is another example where if you're just overly passive, you're not barreling the turn and you're always folding the river with certain hands that now want to be bluffing, you're again playing a poor strategy. Do you want to know what is inside the Mechanics of Poker program? Go over to the site where you can watch a free 1-hour demo. Hi there, boys and girls, and welcome back to another video here at the Poker Ambition channel, and where today I'm going to educate you guys a little bit on the lifelong debate on blue line versus red line winnings. Okay, how does it actually work? Do we actually need a winning red line in order to have bigger successes in poker? Now, before you guys forget, make sure to give this video a thumbs up. Leave some comments down below, any questions, see what you are struggling with. Is it the red line or is it the blue line? And without further ado, let's get into a couple of points that I want to start off with, and afterwards we'll go into solver to see how this kind of plays out. The first point I wanted to start off with, in giving you guys some more general understanding of how blue line versus red line winnings actually win, is that some hands and certain spots, or playing versus specific opponent tendencies, gain their EV by betting and raising, okay, which is usually means winnings in red line, because when we do betting or raising, or we put our opponent in a situation where he's more likely to fold, okay, or when was a flop goes up, or when to showdown goes down, which usually leads to red line winnings. And in some spots by checking and calling. So if we take the more passive line, or when was a flop will go down, or when to showdown will go up, depending on if we afterwards call or fold, which is a point that I will get to later. And that will usually lead to blue line winnings. And if we obviously do more betting and raising, we will gain more red line. If we do less betting and raising, we will gain more blue line. But it's not that one is necessarily better than the other. It all depends on certain hands, or the spot you're in, or the opponent you're playing against, okay? The second spot is if we take the aggressive or passive action more often, or do it for the sake of being aggressive or passive. And I think doing it for the sake of being aggressive is more common than the sake of being passive. If you're just doing it for the sake of being passive, it's probably your natural tendency, your natural bias leaning towards passivity. We will win more red line or blue line, okay? Kind of goes hand in hand with the point above. If we try to win too much pots, okay, so we're doing too much betting and raising, this will usually come and cost off our blue line, okay, because we are then moving hands that should win money in blue line, we're now moving them to red line. And if pushed too far, also our red line. In general, if you're trying to win for too much pots, you're starting to invest in a lot of pots that you're gonna end up losing. For example, you're maybe a bit too sticky on flop and turn, or try to pull out bluffs, and then at some point villain is just never folding anymore, and we've invested a lot of money in a pot that we're often going to lose. For example, if someone just significantly overfolds the flop, but we do follow it up with aggression later on a bit too often, it will usually lead to losses, okay? If we fight two pots too little, okay, our red line losses will have to be compensated by our blue line winnings. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that this is very bad, okay? Obviously, in some spots, we need to try to win the pot, usually leading to red line winnings. But if you are a bit more on the passive side, but let's say, for example, every time you play, there's a very big wheel on the table who's going to give you their money at some point. That means that you have very high blue line winnings, which means that you can get away with losing more on red line, because your blue line winnings will compensate that because of a certain wheel on the table, for example. This is a good example of, for example, opponent tendencies. If we have a very big wheel who never folds, it's very hard to, and probably not advisable, to try to win red line versus them. The last point, if we are not aggressive with hands that should bet and raise, okay, so we are moving red line hands that should be betting and raising into a more passive line, and don't get to showdown because we fold these hands, okay, that should call, we will be losing green line. And in the end, guys, it is about the green line. So if we move a hand that should win his money by redlining, so by being betting and raising, if we move that to a more passive line, where in order we should maybe call the river, but we ended up folding. We ended up not winning red line by being aggressive, and we also didn't win blue line by getting to showdown, okay? Usually, if both lines go down, your green line, which is in the end going to be the most important, will also go down, okay? So these are a couple of like introduction points that I think is very important before we get to the actual example. And in the end, it is about that green line, guys. If your green line winnings go up, happy life, who cares what the other lines do? For that, we need to ask ourselves where our EV/value should come from, giving our hand the spot and our opponent's tendencies, okay? So I will try to take these points in consideration when looking at the example, and without further ado, we're going to take a look at a solver where it's playing in position as the initial raiser. I'm going to kind of look at it from both sides and kind of spot hands that are trying to gain their EV by redlining and hands that try to gain their EV by blue lining. So we are playing button versus big blind. Flop comes queen 8-6. The big blind checks and it's up to the imposition. Okay, and the first thing that we can notice is that there is some mixed betting going on. Okay, we sometimes check, we sometimes bet small, and we sometimes bet very big. It's kind of the preference on a board with these type of tendencies going on. And we can immediately that certain hands in the darker red want to bet big, which usually leads to your opponent doing more folding. Okay, so usually already our red line winnings go up. A very important point is that certain hands might prefer a red line strategy, so betting more often and maybe for a bigger sizing on an earlier street in order to set themselves up to gain more blue line winnings on a later hand. Okay, this is actually a very big part of playing good poker. If we then look at certain hands, we can see, for example, a hand like ace-king checking most often. This does not mean that betting is minus EV. For example, if we ask the solver, what is the EV of betting or checking, betting small, betting big? We can see here on the right bottom that the EVs are actually quite close, and we shouldn't really take EVs in the solver all too seriously, because you would see that with every hand that basically it doesn't really matter. Well, it does in practice, okay? Depending on the spot, depending on your pool that you're playing against, and specifically on your opponent. But we can clearly see that if we take this example from the solver, it clearly prefers a more passive strategy with ace-king offsuit more often, leading to higher blue line winnings, okay? Other hands prefer betting. So let's say, for example, we did bet. Actually, let's go for the check, and the turn is a deuce, and villain bets. And we can actually see that we're now just folding ace-king off most of the time, okay? So we were basically not really gaining blue line, and we're also not really gaining red line. Whereas if our opponent would bet a bit smaller, let's say 3/4, we're usually calling. So if we would be checking back ace-king and then folding to a bet that's smaller than overbet, we're maybe making a mistake and not winning any green line, okay? This is an example. Whereas if, for example, villain overbets and we are stubborn and decide to call with ace-king off, okay, which means that we're going to win the pot more often, okay, than folding, because obviously if we fold we never win it, but it's not the most plus EV line, usually leading to red line losses, because often we can then fold the river. If we also station the river, so let's say, for example, you're a person who calls here the overbet with ace-king and also calls the river, we are losing massive on blue line, okay? Because it's clearly a spot that the solver just prefers folding, because villain is just not bluffing enough and the EV of our call is just too bad. And now we're just playing red line for the sake of red line, okay? We're just stationing. Obviously, if you never fold, you will win a lot of red line and your blue line will go down the drain. This is not really how poker works. In the end, it has to be in balance. So let's say, for example, we do decide to bet. And here, for example, for the out position, we can already see a couple of red line, blue line tendencies as well. He mostly wants to check raise his king, queen. Let's say, for example, you put that hand into a check call. Means that you will be a little bit more passive and therefore play king, queen in the EV of blue lining. Which, for example, if you play versus someone who's over aggressive, then by all means, let your opponent bluff off and never fold and just gain a lot of blue line. For example, another hand like 5-6 offsuit here, you can see that it's sometimes check raising. If we would always check raise that, we are significantly gaining some red line, okay? And you can clearly see that the solver does prefer to do it some of the time. So probably either blue lining or red lining, it's probably both fine. If we get versus earlier positions, I know that for example versus EP-MP, a hand like 5-6 gets check raised a little bit more often, and this is then because the red line option becomes more attractive than the blue line option, because there's simply less winnings or expected winnings in the more passive line. So let's say for example our opponent calls our small bet, and the turn is the deuce of hearts, and we can see that on the turn our strategy is again split. We basically never want to bet small. In position, usually this is not really a thing. There are some exceptions, but usually the bet sizing goes towards 3/4 and over bet. Okay, this is a very common split if you're playing in position as an initial raiser, which means that certain hands will bet a little bit smaller and villain will fold less often. So we will get the showdown a little bit more often, and certain hands bet very big and villain is going to fold more often. Okay, now this does not necessarily mean, let's say for example, that if you have pocket aces. Okay, pocket aces clearly is a hand that prefers overbetting. If you're the type that says, hey, I'm not going to overbet pocket aces, because if I overbet, villain is always folding a hand like 6-5. I don't want that, okay? This is an option, but then you are confusing that you want to get called, okay? And finding a sizing for which you get called is not necessarily the most plus EV sizing, because we can go very big with a hand like pocket aces and get called less often, but still make more money, okay? And there's still quite a lot of blue line winnings to be gained here, okay? Because we're getting, for example, called by any type of queen. Whereas, for example, certain other hands prefer checking. Again, like the ace-king, for example, checks quite often. Clearly a hand that we could also be betting. So if you start overbetting this, yeah, it's probably plus EV. So you could actually do that and win a lot of red line, but it's not the highest EV option according to the solver. Now, if you play versus someone who's overfolding the turn massively, you might say, okay, I'm gonna overbet ace king. This is a valid option, but we always still have to compare the EV of checking with the EV of betting. Let's say, for example, we have a hand that has very low EV in checking, which is going to be maybe a hand like Jack 5 of diamonds, okay? If your opponent is significantly overfolding the turn, we might want to increase our red line winnings by overbetting a hand like Jack 5 of diamonds, for example, but keep our blue line winnings intact by checking, for example, with a hand like ace king, okay? And this is kind of exploitation, because if we then do this correctly, we can get both our lines up, which few, in my opinion, play a very good exploitative strategy. It's definitely possible at least to get a nice break-even red line and have good blue line winnings. And I also think this is a style that is hardest to play against from your opponent, because if you're just always blue lining, or if you're always focused on red lining and your opponent is onto that, it kind of, you don't really catch your opponent by surprise. Because if I have guys who just over red line, I don't really have a decision anymore as the defender, because if the guy's just over aggressive, I'm just gonna, yeah, okay, call down and hope because he's just out of line. Whereas someone is way too passive, if he just keeps on betting, I'm just gonna keep on folding, okay? So always try to find like that sweet spot in the middle. So let's say, for example, we do decide to check, which certain hands prefer. Let's say, for example, we have a hand like pocket jacks. We can clearly see it preferring to bet. Nines, for example, clearly prefers to bet. There's definitely a concept in there. So let's say we check and the river is, let's say the river is a 4. And we can now see the out of position strategy. We can see that out of position should do quite some betting, even with hands that are as weak as, what is as weak as hands? Looks like a6 is sometimes betting, which again, he bets for a small sizing, but if we bet for a small sizing, villain can fold 28% of the time, and when he folds, these winnings go to our red line winnings, okay? So we can clearly see we want to do quite some betting. Now let's say we never bet these small sizings and we only bet overbet, for example. That means that we're going to be betting less and therefore checking more, and then your opponent can or check behind or bet, and then we usually call or fold. But let's say, for example, we have an 8, okay, and we say, okay, we're never gonna check fold an 8 on the river. We could check, villain bets, and as you can see, we don't really want to get in this line. That's why the hands are not really showing. But any 8 is probably calling, okay? So check calling the river gains us blue line. Whereas clearly the spot in theory is preferred to do a more of a red line approach. It bets himself, right? we can see that most of these hands are betting. So if you would always check these hands, you are missing on red line winnings, right? Same with, for example, a bluff. If you, let's say, for example, we have 9-10, we clearly want to be bluffing. If you don't bluff these hands, you are missing on red line winnings. So let's say, for example, our opponent does bet. And remember the ace king that we talked about earlier, you can see that it now wants to call, or at least half of the time. So a hand like pocket jacks even wants to raise. Actually, I will get to both these hands. Ace king, for example, if we were checking the turn and often folding the river, we're not winning blue line because we folded. We're also not winning red line because we didn't barrel the turn. And this is a clear example. If you're just checking, always folding, you're just playing a poor strategy and you're losing green line, okay? Same with jacks. Jacks, for example, especially versus smaller sizing, always wants to raise. Basically, a lot of your, maybe ace 8, yeah, you can see ace 8, king 8. This is kind of the bottom of hands that you want to be raising. These type of holdings, they don't feel like that a 1/3 bet and a 1/3 bet is getting enough value, so they now want to raise. If you don't make these raises, okay, you might be better off barreling the turn more often, okay? Else you're just clearly losing value. Same with, for example, we talked about the jack 5 diamonds. It's very infrequent, but it raises a very small percentage of the time. Or like a hand like jack 4, for example. This is another example where if you're just overly passive, you're not barreling the turn and you're always folding the river with certain hands that now want to be bluffing, you're again playing a poor strategy, okay? Then it's no longer has something to do with something having a preference, right? And also you can see that in order to increase the efficiency or increase more red line winnings, it actually starts over betting a hand like 10-9. So let's say, for example, you're always betting small with a bluff like 10-9. Maybe this is also a way that if you're lacking some red line to add some more over betting in general to your game, definitely also a boost in red line. Now let's say, for example, actually pocket 7s was, I can actually now see the bottom together with ace-6, which is important for the next card actually I wanted to take a look at. So let's say, for example, the river is an ace, also flush complete, and now actually we see that pocket 7s, obviously ace-6 is now more likely to bet because the hand strength, but 7 is never betting anymore, and also an 8 is not betting anymore. And this is a spot where maybe if you're winning too much red line, that you're not adjusting to the spot, because here clearly we don't really want to be betting small anymore with a hand like 10-8. Obviously we can, but that would just be betting for the sake of betting and no longer because it's the most plus V play. So this is a good example of same hand but a spot that now varies. Also we actually see also that the over betting disappeared. So if we had a hand like 10-9, you see it no longer wants to over bet. There are some reasons for that as well, just an overall strategy shift. Obviously there's still red line and green line, red line, blue line winnings going on, but the spot just plays a little bit differently, okay? Then if villain checks, we can see that we now want to be bluffing a hand like jack 5 of diamonds, which, you know, this makes quite a lot of sense. On the turn we had quite a shitty hand, so we checked back, and then the river he checks again, and now we want to be bluffing. Again, if you would miss these type of bluffs, you are losing red line winnings, okay? You are clearly, these are then definitely spots like bet check bet spots, or maybe like some more turn barreling, especially in spots where people are over folding. These are spots where you can boost your red line winning. So if you have a red line winning leak, okay, then you're maybe missing out on these type of barrels, okay? And then we get a lot of nice hands to fold. I think these type of hands usually automatically folding. The ace 10 and the ace jack, the king jack are reasonable hands. A lot of 6x are folding, so I think this is a fine play. Also in terms of if you are a little bit struggling with your red line, I mean, he should, for example, call pocket trees. If you think pocket trees are not calling in your population, then obviously betting more often with a hand like jack 5 of diamonds will gain you more money. And this is actually something that the MDA movement, the mass data analysis movement always talks about, that a lot of spots in the population, it is more common that they do overfolding than underfolding. Therefore, having more of a preference towards red line strategies is a good idea. However, if you are the type who's overwinning on red line, you are clearly ignoring the fact that certain hands should also have a lot of EV in trying to, for example, bluff catch or trying to get to showdown, maybe setting up a little bit of reverse implied odds situation for your opponent, and you're kind of ignoring that. So that would be a leak as well. So I hope you guys start to understand and think a little bit different now about blue line and red line winnings after that example, and kind of start to understand that some hands want to get their value from blue lining and other hands want to get their value from red lining. Now, obviously, we could go on about this topic, and there's a lot of things in play, and it gets a little bit more complicated, and we can add way more nuances, but I would like to keep this video under 10 hours. And I wanted to end up with a couple of points to sum this video up. This is for the redliners. You cannot go to the Ferrari dealer and say that you want to pay in redline winnings, okay? It is not about the redline winnings, okay? You're maybe confusing of winning the pot most often compared to making the highest EV decision, okay? This is a common leak for people who are over fighting for pots. However, if you're losing more than necessary, this is definitely a leak. Okay, people then say, is it a leak to have red line losses? I would say depends on how much. Let's say, for example, for every buy-in you win, you lose around half a buy-in in. So if you win one buy-in on showdown and you lose around half a buy-in in red line, I think that is kind of the, yeah, it shouldn't drop lower than that. Preferably it will go a little bit towards a little bit more towards break even, but if it falls below that ratio, I would say you're definitely leaking, and you should definitely look to play a couple hands more aggressive in certain spots. For example, we saw that the 5-6 hand on the Queen 8-6 from the out of position was already check raising. You're probably missing out on these type of plays, okay? It is not that one style is better than the other. It depends on your hand, the spot, and your opponent. Okay, if you have an opponent who's overfolding, then by all means be more aggressive. Okay, if you have an opponent who's underfolding, then by all means value bet the guy thinly and stop bluffing him. Okay. Point number 3, we naturally lean towards one style. Know yours to see if you should be on the lookout for spots to be more aggressive or passive. So in general, your natural bias or your natural tendency can lean towards being more aggressive or passive. Mine in general, for example, pre-flop, I tend to be a little bit more on the passive side by nature. So if I don't focus on that, I will do way too much calling and way too less 3-betting or 4-betting or 5-betting, whatever you want. Usually leading to a bit more slacking of my red line. Okay, so this is an example of a natural tendency. Other guys may be a bit too aggressive on certain streets, and you know, they're straight up barreling the Jack 5 of diamonds, the Ace Kings, basically any hand that they can. They just say, listen, my opponent's overfolding, I'm barreling range. This is not necessarily how poker works, okay guys? You're kind of ignoring EVs in other lines as well. Now, if you guys need any help understanding when to red line or when to blue line, this is all a concept of where should my EV come from, how does certain strategies generate EV. We have a program, The Mechanics of Poker, in which we can help you get more clarity. Now, if you're having trouble with your red line, blue line ratio in a specific spot, we also start to offer masterclasses, of which the first one is now available, which is how to play 3-bet pots out of position. Definitely more of a red line spot than others, given the nature of the spot. So maybe if you're lacking red line, that could be a masterclass for you. Now, if you're not interested in any of the products, perfectly fine as well. I'm sure, or I hope, you would have gotten some value out of this video. Make sure, if you haven't done so, to subscribe to our channel so you'll be first to know when we release new content. And I wish you guys a lot of luck improving your red line and blue line winnings. Let us know in the comments down below what you were kind of struggling with and what are kind of the main takeaways from this video for you. And I wish you guys a lot of luck at the tables.